Hello, Dr. Greg here again with more information about vitamin D. Today I want to go through a different kind of research paper in regards to vitamin D and breast cancer, but I also wanted to talk about the variety of vitamin D levels, whether and associated with certain conditions. So I'm going to do that first. So we're going to look at just some vitamin D levels. So we're going to start with breast cancer. Breast cancer, they found that there's a 50%, potentially 50% reduction in breast cancer if your vitamin D levels are above 50. So when I say that, the lab will take your vitamin D and will come with a range. And let's say, oh, you're 40. And they'll say its range, a normal person's range is between 35 and 50. Now, that is just sort of an arbitrary number. They really don't know what an optimal range is. So all you have to do is go to research and see, well, what levels of vitamin D do people show have an effect on other conditions of the body? So with breast cancer, they say, or they showed, that if you're above 50 in terms of the number, that's above the 35 to 50 that they say is normal, your chances of breast cancer is reduced by 50%. That's pretty good, right? Now, let's look at colon cancer. Now, colon cancer, if your values are less than 20, remember I said 35 to 50 is considered the normal for vitamin D. If it's less than 20, you have a 75% increase in the chance of getting colon cancer. That's pretty significant. And 20 is pretty low. Now, autoimmune diseases and autoimmune diseases, there's a list of them. MS is an autoimmune disease, rheumatoid arthritis is an autoimmune disease, fibromyalgia is an autoimmune disease, chronic fatigue can be an autoimmune disease as well. Lupus is an autoimmune disease. It's just unbelievably how expansive it is. And they say that vitamin D levels less than 40 can contribute to an increased risk of autoimmune disease. A 3 times greater risk. Diabetes and high blood pressure when your vitamin D is less than 30. Research has shown can increase your risk of diabetes and breast cancer. And bone loss as we get older, right, is a problem, less than 30 as well. So we see a range. Reducing the risk of breast cancer, it's above 50. A lot of these other ones are below 30 or 20, but the normal range is 35 to 50. So how does that make sense for that range to be normal? So I'm going to talk about normal ranges in another video, but I just wanted you to understand the bracketness of this range that they say is normal, where the research is showing that 50 is actually the minimum level that you should be at in order to have all these bodily functions work properly and to avoid, or actually give you a chance to avoid, these diseases that we live in the modern age. Now, what's interesting is these diseases are on the verge of an epidemic. They kill millions of people every year. Millions of people are suffering with these diseases every year. And yet, what's interesting is that we spend a lot more time indoors than we ever have in history. And vitamin D, they call the sunshine vitamin, right? It actually is created through sunshine. So I wonder if there's a connection there. So that's some research that I'm going to try and find out if there is any research for that. But we're going to talk about another type of study, and it is called a meta-analysis, okay? And what a meta-analysis is, it is a study of a bunch of research on a specific topic, which we're talking about vitamin D and breast cancer. All right, so the meta-analysis is vitamin D and breast cancer, a systemic review and meta-analysis of observational studies. Observational studies is looking at blood levels of vitamin D and its relationship to an individual's breast cancer or potential breast cancer. So the summary, the context of this meta-analysis, so what they're doing is they're not actually doing research, they're looking at the research and coming up with some ideas. So the concept, breast cancer is the most common malignancy among women in the US. Vitamin D status and intakes are thought to be inversely associated with breast cancer outcome. Now, or actually breast cancer occurrence. And what they did was they looked at all these sources of all these studies and they came with an analysis. And I'm going to go right down to their conclusion. And I'm just going to scroll down to their conclusion here, the results basically. Now, this is out of 3,826 unduplicated research papers. Remember I told you the other day that there are 2 million research papers produced every year in the United States and the world? This is over 3,000 papers that they looked at, which is quite a job. What they discovered was 22 original publications were selected for the systemic review and meta-analysis. Those selected studies were published between 2005 and 2017, so pretty recent. Now, what they figured is the cumulative sample size, the number of people that were in these studies were over 200,000. So that's a lot of people to look at to see if there's a pattern with vitamin D levels and cancer, breast cancer. And what they discovered is that, I have to go down a little bit and come up with the discussion. There's a discussion page. And it says here, this study is to our knowledge the most up-to-date among very few meta-analysis conducted for synthesized the literature on vitamin D exposure and breast cancer occurrence. Pooled findings indicate that there was a net direct association between vitamin D deficiency and breast cancer occurrence. Now, a weaker inverse association was also observed for total vitamin D intake from foods and supplements and breast cancer. A similar association was noted for supplemental vitamin D. No net association was detected between breast cancer and serum or between vitamin C and dietary vitamin D. There was no evidence of publication bias. All 5 exposures of interest came up as consistent from the harvest plots, suggesting consistency. In recent years, there has been considerable interest in whether vitamin D inhibits breast cancer development. Low serum levels of vitamin D have been reported in breast cancer patients compared to healthy controls, were also associated with poor prognosis. The anti-carcinogenic property of vitamin D comes from the active hormonal form of vitamin D. Experimental studies indicate that can also be synthesized by locally from vitamin D in other tissues, including but not limited to breast, intestines, lung, etc. Here we are with that VDR. Vitamin D receptor is activated by the vitamin D and is found in nearly all tissues and organs in the human body. It is responsible for transportation of numerous genes related to cell proliferation, differentiation, metastasis, and apoptosis. And that's what cancer is a breakdown in the development of new nerve cells. They kind of go crazy, but vitamin D receptors, their responsibility is to ensure that it's done properly by your body. And a deficiency, they found, may actually contribute to the production of aberrant or bad cells, bad cancer cells. So we know that the level of your vitamin D in your blood at 50 is the minimum amount to ensure that you have a 50% chance of not getting breast cancer. And everything below 30 actually increases your chance of a variety of cancers and autoimmune diseases. So we're going to get more down to what levels of vitamin D we should have. And when you get tested, you should be tested by your doc and given that level and find out what it is. And then we're going to address how do you solve if you're deficient or if you're just right, how do you solve that? So that is all I have for today. This is Dr. Greg, changing the way we look at health.